Good to have you back for another Sunday School Teachers Workshop tonight. And our passage happens to be from the Gospel of John, chapter 20. And again, just as a reminder, as you can see on the screen, these particular Gospel passages are the last of the Gospel passages that we will be dealing with before we start Unit 29 in the middle of this particular quarter, which will transition us over to the book of Acts. We will no doubt have a few lapses when we go back to some Gospel passages on the fourth or final Sunday of any particular unit. That's always open and fair game. But just as a way of signaling that to you so that perhaps you'll give some thought to how you might want to wrap up any of the loose threads that you might have left out there for the Gospels that we've been teaching through now for several months. So this particular passage deals with Thomas's doubt. Now, as you may be looking at the title on the screen, clearly, my approach to this is not going to be focusing solely on the personal aspects of Thomas's doubt. And it's not lost on me that this could be perhaps a key moment or lesson by which we could loop in some measure of personal reflection as goes how we may experience doubt as Christians. I really never look at the Gospel Project material, so I can't say whether or not that's part of what the Gospel writer and editors of the curriculum perhaps have chosen to focus on. That could be the case. And so if you're studying along those lines and that's what you're comfortable with and that's what you would prefer to go with, by all means, that's your choice as the Spirit leads, right? But if you have been making an effort in some way to focus on a broader, more biblical meta-narrative perspective here, I do think that there is not a sub-theme here. I would argue this is the primary theme. John did not write the account that's unique to his gospel with respect to Thomas's doubt for the sake of personal reflection. There's a lot going on in these last chapters that deals with individual disciples. Again, John's gospel is unique with respect to the final act, and that is Peter's restoration, with Jesus approaching him and asking him 3 separate times, "Do you love me?" followed by Peter's 3 separate answers. And Jesus' retort or rejoinder to him with, "Then feed my sheep," or "feed my lambs." So there's textual hyperlinks that are connecting those particular passages with respect to these individual disciples. And again, John's gospel at the beginning has actually spent more time focusing on individual disciples than any of the other gospels have. Matthew, Mark, and Luke follow a synoptic tradition of seeing the first of the disciples that are called, the 2 pairs of brothers that are fishermen, and then at least Matthew and Luke follow on with the calling of Matthew or Levi to become the next disciple, focusing primarily on the fact he's a tax collector. And then we just at some point move right into the isolation of the 12 away from the larger group. And so aside from mentioning those names, we really only have a few sparse statements from Peter in those Gospels, and that's it. John, though, sees discussion between Andrew and Peter, and then eventually Philip and Nathanael, and then Jesus and these individual disciples and so forth. And then, of course, unique aspects to conversations that no other gospel writer pays attention to, such as Peter making his proclamation, "Lord, you won't wash my feet," because John's gospel is the only one that shows us this. But I would say if we are paying special attention to John's gospel and the themes that he is beginning for us at the beginning of the gospel, we should not raise to position of primacy any of these individual conversations as being the primary reason that John sprinkles these conversations into his gospels. As you've heard me talk about with respect to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so is the case with John. We need to appreciate the major themes that start the gospel because that is the thread or line of threads that John is going to modularize his gospel around, moving things around or actually tacking in new stories that none of the other gospel writers are focusing on. And the question has to be, why? Why is he paying attention to this detail? And one of those things, going back to our earlier sessions with John that I've tried to isolate for you, is that John is paying special and heavy attention to the eschatological temple. We know this from the first chapter, 14th verse, that this one who was talked about in the opening verse, the Word who was with God and was God, comes to tabernacle amongst us in flesh. And that word tabernacle, of course, means the very thing that we're referencing in the latter half of Exodus, as goes this tent of meeting that God is going to meet with Moses in, that's kind of separate from the tabernacle, but it's the same premise as goes. God is going to meet with man. God is going to discuss with him business and various other things. And then, of course, God will move his presence directly into the tabernacle once it's all pieced together appropriately, and that's where God wants to hold his court as goes, meeting with his subjects and receiving offerings and, of course, blessing them through the person of the high priest. That's a whole separate theological conversation into itself. But as the prophets now have moved past the era of the temple being destroyed by the Babylonians and the resurrection of that temple as a symbol through the actions of Zerubbabel, Joshua, Haggai, Zechariah, those generations of pivotal leaders that came back as refugees to their homeland, and then, of course, for the sake of fulfilling the word of the Lord, built that again as a symbol first, for then guys like Haggai to tack on a blessing to the end of that, saying the glory of this house. And of course, while he's saying this in the backdrop of the newly renovated or completed temple, the idea is that someday the glory of that house, meaning the eschatological temple, is going to be greater than the first, far greater than Solomon's, far greater than anything anybody else would do, like Herod, who was primarily responsible for aggrandizing the temple into truly one of the ancient wonders of the world, as it was said by people like Josephus, that the sun glinting off the gold-gilded roof would give the appearance of a star gleaming in the distance. But of course, that temple was already destined for destruction at the hands of the Romans, even before Jesus sets foot on the scene. So, the question then becomes, what temple? And while some of us may be eyeing a possible third temple, Ezekiel's temple, or whatever the case might be, I think the clear teaching of the New Testament, especially rooted in John's Gospel, is that Jesus is this eschatological temple. And we find this not only rooted there, but then carried forward as a thread of thought through places like 1 Corinthians, Hebrews, and of course there are several other spots to isolate, but I don't want to take up all our time with that. So if we're looking at John establishing this theme for us, and then perhaps what he's doing in the second chapter of his gospel, some may potentially argue for the prospect that John is actually adding a second cleansing to the temple, talking about one being at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, which he is the only person to mention, but then he doesn't carry forward and talk about the actual temple cleansing that occurred at the beginning of his Passion Week, that there's room for that per the reading of the other Gospels, and if you harmonize them together, that perhaps two are there. That is a viable possibility. There's not much to detract away from that with respect to the reading of the New Testament. However, I and others, at least for the moment, I argue that John is treating that concept with a modular idea in mind, that he is moving forward the cleansing of the temple earlier in Jesus' ministry for the sake of showing us what he has already laid down and established in the first chapter of his gospel, that the Word has become flesh and is tabernacled amongst us. Again, he is the fulfillment of the eschatological promise of new temple. And that, of course, John is the only one to mention the statement when they ask by whose authority, and Jesus says, all right, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. They mistake that for the physical buildings around him. And of course, John parenthetically tells us so that his readers, us, understand very clearly Jesus is talking about the temple of his body, which is not a separate temple concept at all. Later in John 4, a woman at the well, he tells her, you're not going to be worshiping on either this mountain that you Samaritans hold sacred or the mountain that we Jews hold sacred and tell you must come and worship at. God seeks for his people to worship him in spirit and truth everywhere. And of course, that hour comes before the end of Jesus' ministry by the climactic moments of his crucifixion and resurrection. By virtue of that, his installation as King of Israel through his humiliating crucifixion and his vindication by the Father, as goes his resurrection and ascension to the cosmic throne of David at the right hand of God. That brings about the advent or inauguration of this eschatological temple as he passes this mission on to his disciples. And of course, we see this thematically throughout the book of Acts as well, though John didn't write that, yet Luke, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, of course, continues to tease out this thread of thought. So what I want to do here is to just take a big series of steps back and appreciate the 30,000-foot view of this. And I do think that it might be worth not only mentioning, but maybe if you want to focus more on the personal aspect of Thomas's doubt, and again, how we as believers might wrestle with doubt, I think that you could definitely do that, both of these in the same lesson, even in a tighter 30-minute window. If nothing else, just drawing your students' attention to the fact that there is a larger biblical picture at play here. So I'll isolate that for you by showing you the navy blue boxes at the begin or at the top of the slide and at the bottom of the slide. At the top of the slide, we're looking at the fall of Jerusalem, and this is supposed to represent something of a linear time frame leading us down to Judah's restoration post-exile. And what we're seeing paralleled on both sides of this are the events that occur around the time Babylon comes knocking on Jerusalem's door, laying siege to the city and destroying it and the temple. And then, of course, what happens after that 70-year captivity is over with. Babylon is no more. Persia is the ruling empire. By virtue of the promise made through Isaiah, God is allowing His people to go back home to their homeland, rebuild this temple. Judah is restored, but of course, there's a caveat posted with that. There's physical restoration, material restoration, but spiritual restoration is several centuries in the coming. These are more or less just winks, foreshadowings at what God's faithful promise is really going to culminate in, and that is the last and final Exodus Messiah will bring. And then we're paralleling that against the actual events of Jesus' Passion Week. Primarily those moments from Jesus' arrest in the garden up through the time of His post-resurrection appearance to these disciples, but notably in John's Gospel, Thomas. So let me say this now to make it clear, so that way I can reiterate it again in the end of this, and hopefully I will have made sense in between. That what I'm postulating here is that we're seeing a series of narrative points between the collection of these literary bodies, and that John is purposefully mapping out the events that chronologically and historically happened to Jesus in this order to show us that Jesus, as the eschatological temple, is mimicking through His own event of crucifixion, passion and all that, resurrection, the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, to see it then reborn in Himself. And that the attitudes of the post-exile Israelites that come back to the land that we're reading about in the books of especially Haggai, I would advance to the front, second to that Zechariah, surrounded a little bit more by Ezra and Nehemiah, that those attitudes are mimicking the attitudes, or I should say, Thomas is mimicking those attitudes. Now, granted, I'm not saying that Thomas is just purposefully doing this because he chooses to be just like those post-exile Jews. Not at all. It's just that John, under inspiration, decades after the fact, is finding how these events parallel one another and is laying this down as a breadcrumb trail for us to pick up on. And then the question looms large, but how are these different? Because just about every gospel writer who is tracking the events of the biblical narrative throughout the Tanakh, the writings of Torah, prophets, and of course the Psalter and the rest of the writings in that portion of Scripture, as Jesus is reliving all of that, as they take the stories, string them along as they do, leaving out details that are not pertinent to the story they're trying to tell. The whole reason they're regurgitating it like this is to show the paradigm flips in just about every sequence, right? Jesus is the Adam that's going out into the wilderness to be tested by Satan. But whereas Adam fell, Jesus doesn't. Whereas Israel's in the wilderness and they continue to strive and test God, strive with and test God, Jesus doesn't. Jesus is obedient. He passes the test. Whereas Israel fails to bring the full manifestation of the kingdom, Jesus inaugurates the kingdom and launches it with great success. So it's a redemption of broken history, and again, it's a flipping of the paradigm, and it shows us at every point something different is going to come about. So at the end of this exercise, we're going to see how that community of post-exile Jews coming back to live through the moment of restoration, how their attitudes were portrayed versus this moment where Thomas doubts, but then how that attitude is flipped, and of course, how things progress forward in this gospel. So let's look first here at the two arrest moments. You've got Zedekiah, a Davidic descendant who is supposed to fulfill that messianic mandate, right? But of course he doesn't. And he is the one who is alive at the time when Jerusalem falls. And we see this, and I'm not going to read all these verses to you because they're on the slide for you. You're more than welcome to. It's just the background information that's present so you can see it's there. And of course, Jesus being a Davidic descendant, but he is the fulfillment of the messianic promise. Zedekiah is brought unto a king who has demanded his seizure and arrest. so that he can make open spoil of him and his sons. The same thing is going to happen in the night of Jesus' arrest. First, he's going to be paraded before Annas. John adds that extra detail again that's unique to his gospel. Others have just made it clear he went straight to Caiaphas' palace. But first he is interviewed by the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who has also been the high priest at various points in recent past. Then from there he is going to go to Caiaphas' house per the rest of the Gospels layout of the Passion Week. And of course, eventually Jesus is going to be brought before Herod. So in all of this, we have an open spoil of the Davidic descendant and a mockery of this messianic figure. Then, in the process, now this of course is speaking a little bit more eclectically of everything that's been going on over a period of several decades, the rulership of different kings. But I'm looking here to isolate the fact that Judah as a whole has ultimately denied Yahweh. And I think Jeremiah sums it up well when he speaks of the idea that God saying his people, which if we understand the time frame that Jeremiah is prophesying in, there is no Israelite kingdom in the north any longer. It's only the southern kingdom of Judah. So granted, this could still be attached corporately to those who are now in exile and have been for more than 100 years. But the point would simply be is that clearly this resounds in the ears of Judah more so than those who are in exile because they've received their punishment. Judah is lingering to this last little glint of hope that somehow they'll escape it all. But Jeremiah is there, boots on the ground, telling everyone that tidal wave of judgment that came through Assyria is now going to come upon them through Babylon. And he says, my people are fools. They do not know me. They are foolish children without understanding. And through their lack of understanding of who it is that they've made covenant with, they have ultimately denied him in relationship. And you think about that. This is exactly what Peter is doing with Jesus, denying to be in relationship with him when he's faced down 3 separate times over the course of those evening hours. And we see it multiple times in the Gospels, but of course John makes it a point to also capture this event, keeping it in sequence. So we move forward after Zedekiah's arrest, and of course Judah has made it very clear they don't know this God they covenant with, not because they fail to worship him. Jeremiah and Ezekiel make it clear they continue to offer everything that's required of them. It's by virtue of their understanding of what he requires of them and their lack of wanting to give that over. They deny being in relationship with him by virtue of that, their obstinance. Jerusalem is ultimately destroyed. Again, this requires a deeper reading of the prophets. There is nowhere near enough time to explain all the verses necessary to build this theology, but I've tried to somewhat over our time together in our many sessions. So if you're kind of somewhat able to remember some of that, cling to it a little bit, I think I can make this summary statement here, and you might agree with me on it, that those prophets, especially when you go to a place like Isaiah 60, if you're looking for a particular background text that might seat you a little firmer in this, that passage starts off with talking about Zion. And of course, that is often synonymous with Jerusalem in the Old Testament being the one city in a landscape of darkness that is bathed with golden light from above, where the glory of God is shining upon it. And of course, this is magnetically drawing the nations out of darkness to come to God, fulfilling the prophecies of Isaiah 2 and 4, everyone coming up to God's cosmic mountain to hear the word of the Lord. This is the only place where refuge can be found in the darkness that blankets the nations. And of course, they're going to talk about God, their God, being righteous, all these many wonderful things. They will bring their expensive baubles. Notice what is mentioned here: gold, frankincense, that will be brought by caravans of camels coming from the Orient to bring these treasures to the city. But the city now is going to be called the Lord our righteousness. It becomes a messianic title of sorts. It's the city itself kind of being transformed or talked about as if it's a person. So in all of that, plus many other texts that the prophets are laying down for us, we can see Jesus is the quintessential Jerusalem. Everything that the city of the living God, where his name is plastered for all time, is meant to embody and represent, whereas the physical standing Jerusalem has become a den of, if I can say it and appreciate that it's a little on the vulgar side, a den of horrors, as John, the visionary of the apocalypse, talks about it in the book of Revelation. That being said, Jerusalem destroyed at the hands of the Babylonians, the quintessential prophetic eschatological picture of Zion, Jesus, Jerusalem, is being crucified. We move that forward. Then after Jerusalem is destroyed, Judah back in the time of the Babylonians, is obviously sent off into exile. Again, Jesus is corporately seen here as his people, Judah. This is, of course, the very tribe he descends from. And as Judah was sent off into exile before, Jesus is now sent off into the exile of death, buried in a rich man's tomb. And, of course, though he has already predicted his rising from the grave 3 days later, everyone just assumes he's going to remain in the grave, or at least, I would say, better than 99% assume he's going to remain there. As we see in the discussion with the disciples on the road to Emmaus, everybody's countenance is downtrodden and dejected by virtue of the fact they think all hope is gone, the battle is over. But Judah springs forth from death, the death of their exile, through Exodus, through no variable that they were able to manipulate on their own, through no tactic or strategy they could formulate. It was just simply God being faithful to the promise he had made to them strategically and specifically through Jeremiah. The prophets are speaking about Exodus coming on the back end of this great conflagration, but nobody puts it in such concrete terms as Jeremiah, such that Daniel can read that promise and know it does indeed have to pass and be fulfilled as God said it would when he's praying there in Daniel 9. And of course, Jesus does not stay dead. Jesus comes out through the exodus that delivers him from death as he is raised again anew. But again, we're seeing Jesus in this picture frame, this big 30,000-foot view of the meta-narrative of John in connection with all of the Bible around it, is seeing Jesus as the eschatological Jerusalem. Per Isaiah 60, we are also understanding that Jesus is quintessentially the one who bears the hopes and promises of his people. He is Judah. Apart from him, there really is no Judah, or Israel for that matter. And then we go to this final green box on the left side of the screen. But what happens when these people, as refugees, go back to their homeland? At first, it would seem there's all cause and reason to celebrate. I mean, this is the reason why, though Isaiah has already recorded it, and it is posted for us in 2 Chronicles, we should remember, though, as we are reading the Bible as if Jews were reading the Old Testament or the Tanakh, 2 Chronicles does not come after Kings. We move right from 1st and 2nd Kings straight into Ezra and Nehemiah. So we don't get recorded for us by the chronicler this great promise by Cyrus that he was going to let these people go back. And we would first come into a connection with this through Isaiah, which again still doesn't come to us before Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra is really starting off with this great promise of hope that Cyrus has made this proclamation that he is recording and preserving for us in that opening chapter of Ezra. But once we get through chapter 3 into chapter 4, we realize very quickly that there is a lot of hesitation on the part of the people there. They're afraid to press the issue because now there's a royal edict to cease and desist all efforts at trying to build or improve upon anything. So with that in mind, they just completely stop. They do not continue to exercise faith that God will be with them. It takes him raising up prophets, Zechariah, but notably Haggai, in his very short scroll in those 2 short chapters. He's the one that's more on the nose with what do you think's more important? Living in your paneled houses, right? Or while the house of the Lord lies in ruins, or should you invert that? Should you be dedicating yourself to the fortunes of building the Lord's house instead? And what do we see play out? We see that these people start going back to the building project. They don't wait for a reversal of that royal decree. My point in all of this is not to just regurgitate history. It's to show you there's doubt. There's already doubt present in Ezra when the foundations of the temple are finished and you have a dichotomized group of people. You've got people who are born in captivity who are so overjoyed at the idea that they have got to see the promise of the Lord being fulfilled. Here they are, back in their land, building this temple. Whereas those who are old enough to remember what the former temple looked like are weeping out of sorrow as this one, for some reason, is not going to be as big as and as glorious as what Solomon had built. So there's already doubt as to what manner of fulfillment, as goes the promises that these prophets pre-exile made, is going to be what they live through. They have a Davidic descendant with them, Zerubbabel. He could have been the one who fits the bill of Messiah, but instead of him being king, he's governor. And Isaiah had already told them before they go off into exile that it won't be a Davidic descendant who brings about the immediate release of these people once the exile comes to its end. It's going to be a pagan, Persian, anointed shepherd king that's going to bring that about for them. And they struggle with that promise. Isaiah 40 through 48 is dedicated to all of that discussion that God has with His people through His prophet. So if there's doubt circulating amongst the people as to how God is going to be faithful, beyond just them rebuilding the temple and letting them have their land back, but yet still under Gentile overlords, when is the Davidic descendant going to come? When are they going to rule the nations and all this stuff? What exactly is their post-exile mandate, their marching orders? And we see that play out over the intertestamental period. We don't have a lot of biblical literature, but we do have a snapshot in Malachi of what that looks like as attitudes are souring even more with them bringing lame offerings that are not fit per the Levitical code to be offered. And of course, if you read some Second Temple literature with everything that happens in that land as goes the wars amongst the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and various other things, things continue to sour up to the point where Rome takes over and oppression gets even worse and they're yearning and waiting for Messiah. So now that brings us to Thomas. Thomas sees the resurrected Jesus. Thomas, before he sees the resurrected Jesus, holds this posture: he will not believe. It doesn't matter what testimony anybody gives, man or woman. And if we read through what precedes this, we understand that Peter and John have already ran to the tomb. They've not seen the resurrected Jesus quite yet. Well, let me caveat that. They do by the time that Thomas joins them. They haven't seen the resurrected Jesus by the time they run to the tomb. But before Thomas lays eyes on Jesus, he's got the witness of the other 10 disciples, plus the women. He still won't believe until he can see for himself. And again, there's a lot to say perhaps with respect to Thomas's attitudes. If you as a teacher want to go back to the earlier moments in John's gospel, around the vicinity of John 9 through 11, where Thomas is bold enough to say, hey, if he's going to go back to Judea, his life's going to be threatened, he may die, then let's go with him. Let's die. And then how does his attitude change now to, I will not believe until I see it for myself? That is a worthwhile conversation perhaps. But again, I think we offer up at the expense of that conversation the connection that John is trying to make to the larger biblical meta-narrative here. And I would opt instead that perhaps as we see what Thomas is doing here, that we see Thomas is taking the position now, as you've seen, point for point, we've paralleled these events between the events of Judah falling, Jerusalem being destroyed, the temple being destroyed, Jesus' crucifixion, he as Judah, Israel, temple, all of that being destroyed, but it was all brought back through restoration. And the end, the capstone of John's gospel is all about restoration, is it not? This is chapter 20 where Thomas is. What do we see in chapter 21? John's the only one who records Peter's restoration. Why is this so important? The early community of disciples to whom John is writing would have known this. Would it have been important for us to know this? Would it somehow sour the message of the gospel if we didn't know what happened to Peter after he rejected Jesus? You might say, well, John throws that on there because nobody else wants to answer that question. Maybe that's true. Or maybe it's to show us in this theme that's developing through all of this, temple was supposed to be the highlight moment of God's restoration because God's presence would be restored to His people. God did not do anything to christen that new temple in the days of Zerubbabel, right? Tabernacle, God's presence, and fire fall. Solomon temple, God's presence, fire fall. Zerubbabel, Joshua, new temple, great celebration, no revelation of God's presence, no fire falling. Jesus comes, Spirit falls, clearly fire falls at the moment of Pentecost. All of this to show that the new eschatological temple in this case has indeed been filled with God's presence and chosen, approved by Him. So, that community of exiles, they doubt. They continue to linger in doubt for centuries. They continue to question. They need the expert opinion of rabbis and sages to start dicing up for them. What are we supposed to do? How long until? What manner of fulfillment? Now it all becomes resoundingly clear in the person who's standing in front of them, who's holding out nail-pierced hands, spear-ridden side, scarred up brow from the thorns and all that to show he has defeated death, hell, and the grave, and true spiritual restoration is now in tow. For then Thomas to no longer be indecisive and say, my Lord and my God. If history proves anything to us, if we're supposed to understand it for what it is, then look to the monuments that continue to exist to venerate Thomas today in the country of India. Now again, if you know anything about it, you might say, well, I don't know. There might not be a lot of historical credence to this. You may be hearing this for the first time, in which I invite you to go and research it. But it would seem the evidence is a little bit more confirmatory than it is detracting. Either way, if it's true, imagine that. Thomas in this ancient world traversed an entire continent so convinced at what he had seen in the resurrected body of Jesus, and that temple had come, and that God's plan for His people was indeed fulfilled in Jesus, and this meant fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant to bless all the nations of the world, to take, per what John says from the words of Jesus in John 4, and bring the temple presence of God to the furthest extent of the map. If that is indeed what he is supposed to understand and take away from the resurrected Jesus, then it didn't hold Thomas back anymore. And he went to a group of people who didn't know who the God of heaven was, much less the Son he had revealed Himself through. And he invited these people to come in faith, to repent of their sins, and embrace the Son of God, and be invited into this covenant family. So I think we can say that Thomas's doubt, no doubt, no pun intended, was cured. And we see how the paradigm changes and all of that. All right, so enough of my babbling. Any questions, comments? No? Well, thank you all for listening.